The notification popped up on my phone at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a rainy Thursday afternoon in downtown Portland. I was sitting in my cramped cubicle at Cascade Marketing Group, mindlessly scrolling through analytics reports when the alert made my blood run cold. Motion detected in living room camera 3. But I wasn't at my parents' house. I hadn't been there in over a week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My finger hovered over the notification, confusion clouding my thoughts. Why was I receiving alerts from my mother's smart home system? I'd never downloaded her security app, never been given access, never even been told what brand of cameras she'd installed throughout their Beaverton home. The rain drummed against the office windows as I stared at my screen, that sinking feeling you get when something isn't quite right beginning to settle in my stomach. The mistake had been so simple, so innocent. Linda Mitchell, my mother, had been setting up her new Secure Home Pro system for months, claiming it was all about family safety and security. She'd mentioned it casually during our regular Sunday dinners, waving her hand dismissively when I asked about privacy settings. "Oh, Sarah, you worry too much about these things. It's just to keep an eye on the house when your father and I are away." But what she hadn't mentioned was that somehow my phone number had been linked to her account as a secondary contact. I sat there in my ergonomic office chair, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, trying to make sense of the notification. The timestamp showed it was from the previous Sunday when I'd been at their house for dinner. Camera 3. Living room, motion detected. I'd been motion apparently, and I'd been recorded without my knowledge. The realization hit me like ice water. If I was getting notifications now, how long had this been going on? How many of my visits had been monitored, recorded, stored in some digital cloud somewhere? Every conversation with Jake, my boyfriend, every private phone call I'd taken in what I thought was the safety of my childhood home, every moment I'd assumed was just between family. My coworker Amanda Wells leaned over the partition between our desks, her blonde hair catching the harsh office lighting. "You okay, Sarah? You look like you've seen a ghost." I quickly locked my phone screen, forcing what I hoped was a casual smile. "Just tired," I lied, though my mind was racing faster than it had in months. Amanda shrugged and went back to her own computer, leaving me alone with the growing dread spreading through my chest. The rest of that afternoon crawled by like molasses. I kept checking my phone, expecting more notifications, more evidence of whatever digital surveillance had been quietly documenting my life. But nothing came. Just the usual work emails, text messages from Jake about dinner plans, the mundane digital noise of a normal Thursday. Except nothing felt normal anymore. When 5 o'clock finally arrived, I gathered my things with unusual urgency. My navy blazer, my leather portfolio, my keys that suddenly felt heavier in my hands. The elevator ride down to the parking garage seemed endless, each floor ding another opportunity for my imagination to run wild. What else had those cameras captured? What conversations had my mother heard that were never meant for her ears? The drive to my downtown loft in the Pearl District passed in a blur of red traffic lights and windshield wipers fighting the persistent Oregon drizzle. I lived in a converted warehouse building, all exposed brick and industrial lighting, the kind of place that screamed independence and urban sophistication. It had been my refuge since moving out of my parents' house 3 years ago, my proof that Sarah Mitchell could make it on her own terms. But as I climbed the stairs to my third-floor apartment, keys jingling against the metal railing, I realized that refuge might have been an illusion. If my mother had been monitoring my visits, documenting my comings and goings, recording my conversations, then nowhere had truly been safe. The thought made my hands shake as I fumbled with the deadbolt. Inside my loft, the familiar comfort of exposed beams and polished concrete floors did little to calm my racing thoughts. I set my purse down on the kitchen island, a piece of reclaimed wood I'd found at a local antique shop, and immediately pulled out my phone. The notification was still there, taunting me with its simple message. Motion detected. Camera 3. As if I were just another intruder in my own family home. I paced across my living room, my heels clicking against the concrete, trying to piece together the timeline. When had my mother installed this system? She'd been talking about home security for months, ever since the Hendersons down the street had been burglarized last spring. But the way she described it made it sound like basic door and window sensors, maybe an alarm system. She'd never mentioned cameras throughout the house, never mentioned recording capabilities, and she'd certainly never mentioned that I would somehow be connected to the system. The more I thought about it, the more disturbing it became. My mother, Linda Mitchell, had always been what people politely called involved in my life. Even after I'd moved out, she had opinions about my job, my apartment, my relationship with Jake. She'd drop by unannounced sometimes, using the excuse that she was in the neighborhood even though the Pearl District was nowhere near her usual haunts. She'd ask probing questions about my finances, my social life, my future plans, always with that concerned mother smile that made it hard to push back. But this felt different. This wasn't just maternal concern or boundary-crossing curiosity. This was systematic surveillance of my private life, and I'd been completely unaware of it until a software glitch revealed the truth. I sank into my gray sectional sofa, the one Jake had helped me pick out at a furniture store in Washington Square, and tried to remember recent visits to my parents' house. Had I said anything sensitive? Had Jake and I had any private conversations in their living room? The memory that surfaced made my stomach drop even further. 3 weeks ago, Jake and I had been sitting on their couch after Sunday dinner, talking quietly while my parents were in the kitchen cleaning up. We'd been discussing our relationship, our future together, whether we were ready to take the next step and move in together. It had been an intimate conversation, the kind couples have when they think they're alone, when they're being vulnerable and honest about their hopes and fears. If Camera 3 had audio recording capabilities, if my mother had access to that footage, then she'd heard everything. She'd heard Jake tell me he was ready to propose. She'd heard me admit I wasn't sure I was ready for marriage yet. She'd heard us discuss our concerns about student loans, about my family's expectations, about whether we wanted children. The violation felt complete and nauseating. I pulled a throw pillow into my lap, clutching it like armor against the growing realization that my privacy had been systematically destroyed by the person who was supposed to protect it most. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. Still on for dinner tonight. Thinking of trying that new Thai place on Hawthorne.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Normal circumstances, I would have been excited. We'd been talking about checking out Lemongrass Kitchen for weeks, but nothing felt normal anymore. How could I sit across from him at dinner, pretending everything was fine, when I knew my mother might have recordings of our most private conversations? I typed back a quick response. Can we do takeout instead? Long day at work. It wasn't entirely a lie, though the length of the day had nothing to do with marketing reports and everything to do with the growing pit in my stomach. As the afternoon stretched into evening, I found myself walking circles around my apartment, my mind churning through possibilities and implications. How many other people were connected to my mother's security system? Did my father know about the extent of the monitoring? Did my younger brother Kevin, who still lived at home while finishing his degree at Portland State, know that every conversation in their house was potentially being recorded? The question that haunted me most was whether this had been intentional. Had my mother deliberately added me to her security system so she could monitor my visits? Or had it been some kind of setup error, a technological mistake that had accidentally given her access to spy on my life? Either possibility felt like a betrayal, but the intentional scenario made me feel physically sick. I tried to think back to when the system had been installed. My mother had been vague about the timeline, mentioning it over several Sunday dinners, without ever giving specific dates. She'd shown me the sleek control panel by their front door, demonstrated how the sensors would alert her if windows were opened, talked about the peace of mind it gave her and my father when they traveled to visit Kevin's college or take their annual trip to the Oregon coast. But she'd never mentioned cameras in the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. She'd never mentioned audio recording. She'd never mentioned that the system could send alerts to multiple phones, or that someone could potentially access live feeds of what was happening inside the house. The omissions now felt deliberate, carefully crafted to hide the true scope of what she'd installed. By the time Jake arrived with pad thai and spring rolls from our usual spot on Division Street, I'd worked myself into a state of quiet panic. He took one look at my face and set the takeout bags on my kitchen counter, immediately pulling me into a hug. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. Jake had always been good at reading my moods, probably better than I was at hiding them. We'd been together for 2 years, long enough for him to recognize when something was seriously bothering me. "You look like someone died." I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to show him the notification, explain about the cameras, share my growing horror at what had been happening. But something held me back. Maybe it was the fear that talking about it would make it more real. Maybe it was the shame that came with realizing I'd been so oblivious to what was happening in my own family. Or maybe it was the protective instinct that made me want to fully understand the situation before dragging him into what might become a very messy confrontation with my parents. Just work stuff, I said. The lie tasting bitter in my mouth. Budget meetings next week, you know how I get. Jake nodded, accepting the explanation, even though I could see in his dark eyes that he didn't entirely believe it. He'd learned over our relationship that sometimes I needed space to process things before I was ready to talk, and he respected that boundary even when it clearly worried him. We ate dinner mostly in silence, the excellent pad thai tasting like cardboard in my mouth. Jake tried to make conversation about his day at the software development company where he worked, about a new project involving mobile app security that would normally have interested me. But I found myself unable to focus on his words, my mind constantly drifting back to that notification, to camera 3, to the growing certainty that my mother had been systematically violating my privacy for months. After Jake left that night, promising to check in with me tomorrow, and making me promise to call if I needed anything, I sat alone in my apartment with my laptop open on the coffee table. The notification was still on my phone, and I'd finally worked up the courage to investigate what it might mean. I started with a simple Google search, Secure Home Pro Camera System. The results were enlightening and disturbing in equal measure. The system my mother had installed wasn't just basic home security, it was a comprehensive surveillance setup with high-definition cameras, two-way audio, motion detection, cloud storage, and the ability to share access with multiple family members through a smartphone app. The marketing materials boasted about features like discrete indoor monitoring and family safety coordination. There were testimonials from parents who used the system to keep track of teenage children, elderly family members who wanted relatives to be able to check on them remotely, and families who shared access so everyone could monitor their homes while traveling. But there were also forum discussions about privacy concerns, legal questions about recording people without consent, and technical support threads about notification glitches and unwanted access sharing. I read through dozens of posts, my anxiety growing with each story of families torn apart by surveillance overreach, of relationships destroyed by violations of trust. One post in particular caught my attention. A user with the handle PortlandMom55 had written, "Finally got the Secure Home Pro system set up perfectly. Added my daughter's number as emergency contact so I can keep an eye on things when she visits. She has no idea she's even connected to the system. Peace of mind is priceless." The timestamp on the post was 6 months ago. The location tag showed Beaverton, Oregon. The user's age and location matched my mother perfectly, and the casual way she described adding me to the system without my knowledge made my blood run cold. This hadn't been an accident. This had been deliberate. I screenshotted the forum post, my hands trembling slightly as I saved it to my phone. Whether or not Portland Mom 55 was actually my mother, the post perfectly described what had happened to me. I'd been added to a surveillance system without my knowledge or consent, and someone had been monitoring my visits to my family home for months. The more I researched, the more I understood the scope of what had been happening. The Secure Home Pro system stored all video and audio recordings in the cloud for up to a year. Users could access live feeds, review past recordings, set up custom alerts for specific activities, and even share clips via email or social media. If my mother had been systematically recording my visits, she had nearly 2 years' worth of my private conversations, intimate moments with Jake, personal phone calls, and casual family interactions stored in her account. I thought about every Sunday dinner over the past 18 months, every holiday gathering, every casual drop-by visit. How many times had I confided in Jake about work stress while sitting on their living room couch? How many times had I taken private phone calls from friends, assuming I had privacy in the space where I'd grown up? How many times had my mother nodded along sympathetically to conversations she'd already heard through her hidden cameras? The betrayal felt comprehensive and suffocating. This wasn't just about privacy violation, though that was certainly bad enough. This was about the fundamental trust between a mother and daughter being shattered by systematic deception. Every interaction we'd had over the past year and a half now felt contaminated by the knowledge that she'd been secretly monitoring me, that she'd had access to information about my life that I'd never chosen to share. As midnight approached, and the rain continued its steady drumming against my windows, I finally closed my laptop and tried to prepare for bed. But sleep felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined my mother sitting in her Beaverton home, scrolling through recordings of my life like episodes of a television show. I imagined her and my father discussing conversations I'd had with Jake, analyzing my behavior, making judgments about my choices based on information they'd stolen from me. The worst part was the uncertainty. How much did they know? What had they heard? What decisions in my life over the past 18 months had been influenced by information they'd gathered through their secret surveillance? Had they used overheard conversations to manipulate situations, to guide family discussions, to interfere in my relationship with Jake? I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, and listening to the familiar sounds of my buildings settling around me. Somewhere across town, in a suburban house I'd once considered a safe haven, cameras were still recording. Motion sensors were still monitoring. And a woman who was supposed to love and protect me was still systematically violating my privacy with every visit. But for the first time since that notification had appeared on my phone, I felt something besides shock and betrayal beginning to take root. It started as a small spark of anger, a flicker of indignation that someone thought they had the right to treat me this way. As the hours passed and sleep continued to elude me, that spark grew into something harder and more determined. They had underestimated me. They had assumed I would never find out, that I would continue making my regular visits, having my private conversations, living my life under their digital microscope, without ever realizing I was being watched. They had counted on my ignorance, my trust, my assumption that family meant safety. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical for Portland in November, but the weather matched my mood perfectly. I'd managed maybe 3 hours of broken sleep, my mind churning through possibilities and spinning worst-case scenarios until exhaustion finally claimed me around 4 in the morning. Now sitting at my kitchen island, with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, I stared at my phone screen displaying that damning notification from yesterday. Motion detected in living room camera 3. The timestamp mocked me, last Sunday 2:47 p.m. I remembered that exact moment now. Jake and I had been talking about his upcoming promotion, discussing whether the salary increase would be enough for us to consider getting a place together. We'd been whispering, thinking we were being considerate of my parents cleaning up in the kitchen. Instead, we'd been providing my mother with front row seats to our most private relationship discussions. I needed proof. I needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening before I could figure out how to respond. The notification system had been a mistake, a glitch that revealed what was supposed to stay hidden. But if I could access the Secure Home Pro app that was apparently linked to my phone number, I might be able to see exactly what my mother had been recording. My fingers trembled slightly as I searched for the Secure Home Pro app in the App Store. The download seemed to take forever, my apartment's Wi-Fi crawling at the worst possible moment. When the installation finally completed, I opened the app with the kind of dread usually reserved for medical test results or performance reviews. The login screen appeared, clean and corporate, asking for email and password. But there was also an option that made my stomach lurch: sign in with linked device. Below it in smaller text, if your device has been added as a family member or emergency contact, tap here to access your shared account. I tapped the button, holding my breath. The app immediately opened to a dashboard, showing live feeds from multiple cameras. Kitchen's camera 1. Hallway camera 2. Living room camera 3. Master bedroom camera 4. Kevin's room camera 5. Back patio camera 6. 6 cameras. 6 different angles, covering nearly every inch of my childhood home. The living room feed showed an empty couch, where Jake and I had sat dozens of times over the past year and a half. The kitchen camera captured the breakfast nook, where my family gathered for Sunday dinners. Even Kevin's bedroom was monitored, though I hoped that particular feed was only accessible to my parents, and not to me as a secondary contact. But it was the recording history that made my hands start shaking. Months and months of stored footage, organized by date and camera location. I scrolled back to last Sunday, selected living room camera 3, and found the timestamp that matched my notification. With a sick fascination, I watched myself and Jake enter the frame, settling onto the familiar brown leather couch that had been in that spot for as long as I could remember. The audio quality was crystal clear. Every word of our conversation was perfectly audible, from Jake's excitement about his promotion to my concerns about student loan debt affecting our ability to qualify for a mortgage. I watched us lean closer together, thinking we were having a private moment, completely unaware that every whispered confidence was being recorded and stored in a digital cloud somewhere. I fast-forwarded through the footage, watching our body language, seeing the intimate way Jake touched my hand when he talked about our future together. This wasn't just surveillance, it was voyeurism. My mother had been watching my relationship unfold like a reality television show, with access to moments that even my closest friends hadn't witnessed. Rage began to build in my chest, hot and unfamiliar. I wasn't typically an angry person. Growing up, I'd been the peacekeeper, the one who avoided confrontation and smoothed over family tensions. But this felt different. This was a violation so complete, so systematic, that anger seemed like the only rational response. I scrolled back further in the recording history, randomly selecting dates over the past 18 months. Valentine's Day, when Jake had brought me flowers, and we talked about love languages, while helping my mother prep dinner. My birthday in August, when I'd received a difficult phone call from my college roommate going through a divorce, and had stepped into the living room for privacy. Thanksgiving last year, when Kevin had confided in me about struggling with his grades, and feeling overwhelmed by college pressure. Each recording felt like another layer of betrayal. Not just my privacy had been violated, but Jake's, Kevin's, and countless friends who had visited the house, thinking they were in a safe, private space. How many conversations had my mother overheard that were never meant for her ears? How many times had she responded to situations with knowledge she shouldn't have possessed? The realization hit me like a physical blow. This explained so much about recent family interactions. 3 months ago, when Jake had mentioned to my parents that he was considering switching jobs, my mother had immediately launched into a speech about stability and the importance of staying with a secure company. At the time I'd thought it was typical motherly advice. Now I realized she'd probably overheard our private conversations about his job dissatisfaction weeks before he'd chosen to share that information with my family. Last month, when Kevin had seemed stressed during Sunday dinner, my mother had casually brought up resources for academic counseling, as if the idea had just occurred to her. But I remembered now that Kevin and I had discussed his struggles in that very living room just days before. She'd been acting on intelligence, gathered through secret surveillance, manipulating family conversations based on information she'd stolen. The coffee in my mug had gone completely cold, but I couldn't stop scrolling through the recordings. Each timestamp was another violation, another moment of assumed privacy that had actually been monitored and stored. I found footage of myself crying on their couch after a particularly difficult day at work, calling my best friend Amanda to vent about office politics. I found recordings of Jake and me having quiet arguments, the kind of minor relationship friction that every couple works through, but never wants an audience for. But the recording that broke something inside me was from 6 months ago. I'd been going through a health scare, waiting for test results after finding a lump during a self-exam. I'd been terrified, but I hadn't wanted to worry my parents until I knew more. Instead, I'd confided in Jake while we were waiting for my parents to return from the grocery store. I'd cried in his arms, sharing my fears about cancer, about mortality, about all the things I wanted to do with my life if I got the chance. My mother had heard all of it. She'd known I was scared, known I was waiting for medical results, known I was struggling with anxiety about my health, and she'd said nothing. She'd acted completely normal during the weeks I was waiting for test results, never offering support, never acknowledging my fear, never letting on that she knew I was going through the most terrifying experience of my adult life. The test results had been benign, thankfully, but the memory of going through that fear alone, while my mother secretly knew about my struggle, made me feel nauseous. What kind of person watches their child suffer and says nothing? What kind of mother prioritizes secret surveillance over offering comfort during a health crisis? I closed the app and set my phone down on the counter with more force than necessary. The rage that had been building all morning finally reached a breaking point, but instead of screaming or throwing things, I found myself becoming very, very quiet. This wasn't the kind of anger that exploded outward. This was the cold, calculating fury that demanded strategy and precision. My phone rang, the sudden sound making me jump. Linda Mitchell appeared on the caller ID, my mother's smiling contact photo mocking me from the screen. For a moment I considered answering, considered confronting her immediately about what I'd discovered. But something held me back. If I acted on emotion now, if I let her know what I'd found before I fully understood the situation, I might lose the opportunity to gather all the evidence I needed. I let the call go to voicemail, watching as the notification appeared on my screen. A few seconds later, a text message followed. "Hi honey, just checking in. Haven't heard from you since Sunday dinner. Hope everything's okay at work. Love you." The casual normalcy of the message made my skin crawl. She was performing the role of concerned mother, while sitting on 18 months' worth of secret recordings of my private life. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How could someone systematically violate their child's privacy, while simultaneously pretending to care about their well-being? I forwarded through my recent text history with my mother, looking at our conversations with new eyes. Her responses to my updates about work, my relationship with Jake, my general life developments suddenly seemed suspiciously well-informed. She'd been asking follow-up questions about things I'd never directly told her, making comments that suggested she knew more about my daily life than our actual conversations would have revealed. 2 weeks ago, I'd mentioned to Jake while sitting in my parents' living room that I was considering taking a pottery class at the community center. I'd never brought it up with my parents directly, but during our next phone conversation, my mother had casually mentioned seeing an advertisement for art classes and wondering if I might be interested in trying something creative. At the time, I'd been pleasantly surprised by how well she knew my interests. Now I understood, she'd simply been responding to surveillance intelligence. The manipulation felt comprehensive and sophisticated. My mother hadn't just been passively recording my conversations, she'd been actively using that information to guide family
interactions to appear more connected and caring than she actually was. Every piece of seemingly intuitive motherly advice, every perfectly timed suggestion, every moment where she'd seemed to understand my needs without me expressing them, had potentially been based on information she'd stolen from my private conversations. I spent the rest of the morning documenting what I'd found. Screenshots of the app dashboard, photos of the recording history, notes about specific incidents where my mother had acted on information she shouldn't have possessed. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew I needed to be methodical about gathering it. If this situation escalated into something legal, I wanted to have a complete record of the violation. By noon, I'd compiled a timeline that stretched back nearly 2 years. The camera system had been installed gradually, starting with just the front door and expanding to cover the entire house over several months. My phone number had been added to the account 8 months after the initial installation, which corresponded with a period when my mother had been asking a lot of questions about my contact information, claiming she wanted to update her emergency contact lists. The pattern was clear: this hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision or a technological accident. My mother had planned this surveillance operation carefully, adding cameras room by room, testing the system, and eventually finding a way to include me as an unwitting participant. The fact that I'd only discovered it through a notification glitch suggested she'd been successful in her goal of monitoring me without my knowledge. Around 1 o'clock, Jake texted asking if I wanted to grab lunch. Under normal circumstances, I would have jumped at the chance to see him, to talk through what I was feeling, to get his perspective on the situation. But I wasn't ready to tell him about the recordings yet. How could I explain that his most private conversations with me had been monitored by my mother? How could I admit that our relationship had been under surveillance for over a year? I texted back that I wasn't feeling well and needed to rest, another lie in what was becoming a string of deceptions. But I justified it by telling myself I needed more information before I could involve Jake in what might become a very messy family confrontation. He deserved to know what had happened, but he also deserved to hear the complete story, not just fragments and speculation. Instead of lunch, I drove to Grind Coffee on Burnside Street, a busy cafe where I could sit anonymously and continue my research. The background noise of espresso machines and casual conversation provided cover as I dug deeper into the technical capabilities of the Secure Home Pro system. What I learned made the violation feel even more comprehensive. The system didn't just record video and audio, it tracked patterns of movement, logged entry and exit times, and could even analyze voice patterns to identify different speakers. My mother potentially had access to data about how often I visited, how long I stayed, who I brought with me, and what topics we discussed most frequently. The privacy implications were staggering. Not only had my conversations been recorded, but my behavioral patterns had been quantified and stored. The system could tell my mother things about my life that I might not even be consciously aware of myself. How often did Jake and I argue? What subjects made me emotional? How did my voice change when I was stressed, or excited, or sad? As I sat in that busy coffee shop, surrounded by people having their own private conversations, I realized that my understanding of privacy itself had been fundamentally altered. Every casual interaction now felt potentially monitored. Every family gathering would be forever changed by the knowledge that cameras were recording, that private moments were being stored and could be reviewed at any time. But alongside the violation and betrayal, something else was beginning to take shape. A cold, determined resolve that I'd never felt before. My mother had underestimated me. She'd assumed I would never find out about the surveillance, that I would continue making my regular visits and having my private conversations without ever realizing I was being monitored. She'd counted on my trust, my assumption that family meant safety and privacy. She'd made a mistake in thinking I would stay ignorant forever. And now that I knew the truth, I had a choice to make. I could confront her directly, demand explanations, and hope for an apology that would somehow repair the damage. Or I could be smarter about this, more strategic, more thorough in my response. The angry part of me wanted immediate confrontation. I wanted to storm into their Beaverton home and demand answers, to force her to admit what she'd done and explain why she thought it was acceptable. But the rational part of me knew that approach would only lead to defensiveness, denial, and manipulation. My mother was clearly capable of sophisticated deception. She would undoubtedly be equally skilled at deflecting responsibility and turning the situation around to make me seem unreasonable for being upset. By mid-afternoon, I'd made my decision. I would gather more evidence, document the full scope of the surveillance, and research my legal options before taking any action. If my mother wanted to play games with my privacy, I would show her that I could be just as strategic, just as patient, and far more thorough than she'd ever expected. I spent the rest of Friday afternoon researching privacy laws in Oregon, reading about consent requirements for recording in private homes, and looking into legal precedents for family surveillance cases. What I found was encouraging. Oregon has strong privacy protections, and recording someone without their consent in a space where they have a reasonable expectation of privacy could constitute a criminal offense. The legal landscape was complex, but the basic principle was clear. My mother had likely violated both state and federal privacy laws by recording me without my knowledge or consent. The fact that it was happening in her home didn't necessarily give her the right to record guests, especially when those guests were unaware of the surveillance. Saturday morning, I woke up with a plan. I would continue visiting my parents as normal, acting as if nothing had changed, while secretly documenting the extent of the surveillance system. I would take photos of camera locations, gather evidence of the recording capabilities, and build a comprehensive case about what had been happening. But first I needed to understand exactly what information my mother had access to. I spent Saturday morning going through every recording I could find in the app, making notes about particularly sensitive conversations, documenting instances where she'd later acted on information she shouldn't have possessed. The process was emotionally exhausting. Watching myself be unknowingly recorded for months felt like being violated over and over again. But it also strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. Jake's privacy had been violated. Kevin's privacy had been violated. Every friend who had visited my parents' house, thinking they were in a safe space, had been secretly recorded. By Saturday evening, I had compiled enough evidence to understand the scope of the violation. But I also realized I needed professional help to navigate the legal implications and figure out the best way to proceed. This wasn't the kind of situation I could handle on my own, and I didn't want to make any mistakes that might compromise my ability to seek justice. Sunday morning brought the familiar text from my mother, "Looking forward to seeing you for dinner today. Making your favorite pot roast." The casual normalcy of the message, sent by someone who had been systematically violating my privacy for 18 months, made my stomach turn. But it also represented an opportunity. I would go to Sunday dinner. I would act normal, observe the camera system in person, and gather more evidence. But this time, I would be the one doing the watching. This time, I would be the one with the secret knowledge and the hidden agenda. As I got dressed for what would be my last innocent visit to my parents' house, I felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. My mother thought she had all the power in this situation. She thought her secret surveillance gave her an advantage, allowed her to manipulate family dynamics and control information. She was about to learn that knowledge was indeed power, but it didn't always flow in the direction she expected. And when someone discovers they've been systematically deceived by the person they trusted most, the resulting response can be far more devastating than anything the original deceiver had planned. I grabbed my purse, checked that my phone was fully charged for documentation purposes, and headed out into the gray Portland afternoon. It was time to begin gathering the evidence that would ultimately free me from a family dynamic built on lies, manipulation, and the complete violation of my privacy. But I wouldn't let anger make me sloppy. I wouldn't let emotion compromise my strategy. I would be methodical, thorough, and patient. And when I was ready to act, when I had all the evidence I needed, and a clear plan for how to proceed, my response would be swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating to the people who had thought they could spy on my life without consequences. The drive to Beaverton had never felt longer, but for the first time since discovering the surveillance, I felt like I was taking control of the situation. My mother had taught me an important lesson about the power of hidden information. Now I would teach her what happened when that power was turned against the person who had wielded it so carelessly. The Beaverton house looked exactly the same as it had every Sunday for the past 2 years, but walking up the familiar brick pathway felt like approaching a crime scene. The autumn leaves crunched under my feet as I made my way to the front door, my eyes automatically scanning for the cameras I now knew were there. The doorbell camera was obvious, mounted prominently beside the entrance, but I wondered how many other recording devices were hidden in plain sight. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her face lighting up with that familiar warm smile that had always made me feel safe and loved. Today that same expression felt like a mask hiding something sinister. "Sarah, sweetheart, perfect timing. I just pulled the pot roast out of the oven." She hugged me tightly, and I forced myself to return the embrace, wondering if there were cameras recording this moment of false intimacy. The house smelled like Sunday dinner, that comforting combination of roasted meat, herbs, and the vanilla candles my mother always burned in the living room. Under normal circumstances, these sensory memories would have wrapped around me like a blanket, reminding me of countless family gatherings and childhood comfort. Instead, every familiar detail felt contaminated by the knowledge of what had been happening here for the past 18 months. My father emerged from the living room, beer in hand, wearing his usual weekend uniform of khakis and a Portland Timbers jersey. "Hey kiddo," he said, giving me his typical one-armed hug. "How's work treating you?" I studied his face carefully, looking for any sign that he knew about the surveillance system, any hint of guilt or complicity in what my mother had done. But Bob Mitchell had always been good at compartmentalizing, at focusing on immediate pleasures like football games and weekend projects, while leaving the emotional complexity of family relationships to his wife. Kevin bounded down the stairs, his college-aged energy filling the space as he grabbed me in a proper bear hug. At 25, my younger brother still lived at home, while finishing his degree at Portland State, arrangement that had always seemed practical and financially smart. Now I wondered if he knew his bedroom was being monitored, if he understood that his private conversations and personal activities were potentially being recorded and stored. "Mom's been cooking all day," Kevin said, his voice carrying the easy affection of someone who had never questioned his place in the family hierarchy. "She made that dessert you like, the one with the chocolate and the fancy whipped cream thing." He was referring to her chocolate bourbon trifle, a family favorite that required hours of preparation and had always been her way of showing love through elaborate cooking projects. As we settled into the living room for our usual pre-dinner conversation, I found myself cataloging every detail of the space with new eyes. The camera had to be hidden somewhere with a clear view of the main seating area, somewhere that would capture both video and audio without being obviously visible. My mother had always been particular about home decor, favoring clean lines and minimal clutter, but now I wondered if her design choices had been influenced by surveillance considerations. The brown leather sectional where Jake and I usually sat faced a built-in entertainment center that housed the television, cable box and various decorative objects my mother had collected over the years. Small ceramic sculptures, framed family photos, a few books she'd never quite finished reading. Any one of those items could potentially conceal a recording device, or the camera could be integrated into the television setup itself. My mother settled into her favorite armchair, the one positioned to oversee the entire room like a throne, and began her usual interrogation disguised as family conversation. "So tell me about work, honey. How are things going with that big campaign you mentioned?" I paused, trying to remember if I'd actually told her about the Morrison Industries campaign we'd been pitching at Cascade Marketing Group. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I'd only discussed the project with Jake during one of our private conversations in this very room. "It's going well," I said carefully, watching her face for any reaction. "We should hear back from the client soon." My mother nodded with the satisfied expression of someone whose question had been answered exactly as expected. She didn't ask for details, didn't probe deeper the way she usually did when I mentioned work projects. It was as if she already knew everything she needed to know about the campaign, which she probably did if she'd been listening to my conversations with Jake. The conversation continued in this unsettling pattern, with my mother asking questions that seemed designed to test whether I would volunteer information she'd already obtained through surveillance. She inquired about Jake's promotion prospects, mentioned wondering if I'd been feeling stressed lately, and casually brought up the topic of holiday plans as if she hadn't overheard me discussing my ambivalence about spending Christmas with the family. Kevin, oblivious to the undercurrents, chattered about his classes and his part-time job at a local bookstore. My father provided occasional commentary about sports scores and weekend plans for yard work. To any outside observer, we would have looked like a perfectly normal family enjoying their Sunday routine. The normalcy of it all made the hidden surveillance feel even more disturbing. During dinner, I excused myself to use the bathroom and took the opportunity to examine the hallway more carefully. The camera system had mentioned 6 different locations, and I was beginning to understand how comprehensively the house was monitored. The hallway camera was almost certainly positioned to capture everyone coming and going, tracking who visited when and for how long. In the bathroom, I allowed myself a moment to process the emotional weight of what I was experiencing. Being back in the house where I'd grown up, surrounded by the people who were supposed to love and protect me most, while knowing that every word and gesture was being recorded, felt like being trapped in some kind of psychological thriller. The violation wasn't just technical or legal, it was existential, challenging my fundamental understanding of family privacy and trust. When I returned to the dining room, dessert was being served, and my mother was in full hostess mode, ensuring everyone had enough coffee and that the conversation flowed smoothly. She'd always been good at managing family dynamics, at creating an atmosphere of warmth and connection that made everyone feel included and valued. Now I wondered how much of that skill was natural maternal instinct, and how much was the result of having insider information about everyone's emotional state and private concerns. After dinner, while my mother and Kevin cleaned up in the kitchen, I found myself alone with my father in the living room. This felt like an opportunity to test whether he knew about the surveillance system, to see if I could get any information about his level of involvement or awareness. "Dad," I said casually, settling back into the sectional where so many of my private conversations had been recorded. "Mom mentioned she upgraded the security system. How do you like it?" My father looked up from his phone, where he'd been checking football scores, with the slightly confused expression of someone who hadn't been paying close attention to home improvement projects. "Oh, that thing," he said, waving vaguely toward the front of the house. "Your mother handles all that technology stuff, something about cameras and sensors and whatnot. I just know it beeps when I forget to turn it off before opening the door." His casual dismissal felt genuine, suggesting that he might not fully understand the scope of the surveillance system his wife had installed. This possibility created a new layer of complexity in my understanding of the situation. If my father didn't know about the extent of the monitoring, if he thought it was just basic door and window sensors, then my mother had potentially deceived him as well. The systematic nature of the surveillance might have been her solo project, implemented without full family consultation or consent. I pressed a little further. "Do you ever worry about privacy with all those cameras?" My father shrugged, his attention already drifting back to his phone. "Not really, it's just the front door and maybe a couple other spots. Your mother says it's for security when we travel." His response confirmed my suspicion that he didn't understand the full scope of the system, that my mother had downplayed the extent of the monitoring, even to her own husband. This revelation was both comforting and troubling. Comforting because it meant my father wasn't actively complicit in violating my privacy, but troubling because it suggested my mother was capable of deceiving everyone in her family, not just me. The level of systematic dishonesty required to install comprehensive surveillance while convincing family members it was just basic security suggested a capacity for manipulation that I'd never recognized before. When my mother returned from the kitchen, she immediately noticed that my father and I were talking and inserted herself into the conversation with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to managing information flow. "What are you two discussing?" she asked, settling back into her supervisory chair with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just telling Sarah about your fancy security setup," my father replied, apparently unaware that he'd just provided me with valuable intelligence about the family's knowledge dynamics. "She was asking about privacy concerns." My mother's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, so briefly that I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching specifically for reactions. "Oh, there's nothing to worry about," she said, her voice carrying the reassuring tone she'd always used when dismissing my concerns as a child. "It's just basic security. A few cameras here and there to keep an eye on things when we're not home." The casual way she lied, sitting in a room she knew was being recorded, while talking to the daughter she'd been secretly monitoring for 18 months, demonstrated a level of comfort with deception that made my skin crawl. I nodded as if satisfied with her explanation, but internally I was taking notes. My mother was not only capable of sophisticated technological surveillance, but she was also skilled at managing the family's understanding of that surveillance. She'd convinced my father it was minimal and necessary, while secretly implementing a comprehensive monitoring system that violated everyone's privacy. The rest of the evening proceeded with excruciating normalcy. We watched a movie together, some romantic comedy my mother had recorded, while I tried to focus on the screen instead of wondering where exactly the living room camera was hidden. During the film, my phone buzzed with a text from Jake asking if I wanted him to pick me up, and I quickly replied that I'd drive myself home. The exchange didn't go unnoticed by my mother, who had always been hyper-attentive to family members' communication patterns. "Everything okay with Jake?" she asked, during a quiet moment in the movie. "You seemed a little stressed when you got his text." Her observation was accurate but unsettling, given that my facial expression in response to a text message was hardly something a normal person would monitor so closely. "Everything's fine," I replied, forcing a casual tone, "just coordinating logistics." But her comment made me realize that the surveillance wasn't just about recording conversations, it was about observing behavioral patterns, tracking emotional responses, and building a comprehensive database of information about my personal life. My mother wasn't just listening to what I said, she was studying how I acted, cataloging my reactions, and using that information to insert herself into situations where she had no business being involved. As the evening wound down and I prepared to leave, my mother walked me to the door with her usual routine of last-minute advice and reminders. "Drive carefully," she said, hugging me goodbye. "The roads are still a little wet from this afternoon's rain." She paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to read subtle emotional cues. "You seem a little distracted tonight. Everything really okay?" The question felt like a test, as if she were comparing my current behavior to some baseline she'd established through months of secret observation. I managed what I hoped was a convincing smile, and assured her I was just tired from a long week at work. But her scrutiny made me realize that leaving the house didn't necessarily mean escaping the surveillance. If my mother had been studying my patterns and behaviors for 18 months, she might be able to detect changes in my demeanor that I wasn't even aware of myself. Driving home through the quiet Beaverton streets, I reflected on everything I'd observed during the dinner. The evidence was overwhelming. My mother had installed a comprehensive surveillance system, deceived the family about its scope, and used it to gather intelligence about my private life for over a year. She'd manipulated family conversations based on overheard information, tested my responses to see what I would voluntarily share, and monitored my emotional and behavioral patterns like some kind of domestic intelligence operation. But I'd also learned that my father and possibly Kevin were unaware of the full extent of the monitoring, which meant they were victims of my mother's deception as well. This knowledge created an opportunity for building allies if the situation escalated, but it also meant that confronting my mother directly could potentially devastate the entire family's understanding of their own home security and privacy. Back in my Pearl District loft, I spent the evening documenting everything I'd observed and learned. The camera locations, my family members' apparent knowledge levels, my mother's reactions to various topics of conversation, and the subtle ways she'd tested whether I would volunteer information she'd already obtained through surveillance. The pattern was clear and deeply disturbing. My mother hadn't just been passively recording my conversations, she'd been actively using that information to manipulate family dynamics and manage her relationships with family members. Every seemingly intuitive piece of advice, every perfectly timed expression of concern, every moment where she'd appeared to understand my needs without me expressing them, had potentially been based on intelligence gathered through secret surveillance. As I prepared for bed that night, I made a decision that would fundamentally change the trajectory of my response to this situation. I wasn't just dealing with a privacy violation or a technological betrayal, I was dealing with someone who had demonstrated a capacity for systematic deception and emotional manipulation that extended far beyond anything I'd previously imagined. My mother had taught me that information was power, that knowledge could be used to control and influence relationships, and that trust was something that could be violated systematically without the victim even knowing it was happening. Now I would apply those lessons in ways she never intended, using her own methods against her to build a case that would ultimately free me from a family dynamic built on lies and surveillance. But I would be smarter about it than she had been. I wouldn't rely on technological systems that could glitch and reveal my activities. I wouldn't assume that my victims would remain ignorant forever. And I wouldn't underestimate the devastating power of someone who discovers they've been systematically betrayed by the person they trusted most. The next phase of my response would require professional help, legal advice, and a level of strategic thinking that I'd never had to employ in family relationships before. But my mother had inadvertently prepared me for this challenge by demonstrating just how much damage could be done through patient, methodical, and carefully concealed action. Tomorrow I would begin building the case that would ultimately expose her surveillance operation and free me from a family relationship that had been corrupted by systematic deception and privacy violation. She'd had 18 months to gather intelligence about my life. Now it was my turn to collect evidence about hers. Monday morning found me sitting in the sterile waiting room of Chen & Associates Privacy Law, my hands clasped tightly in my lap as I tried to calm the nervous energy that had been building since I'd made the appointment 3 days earlier. The law office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown Portland high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Willamette River and the bridges that connected the city's east and west sides. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the impressive view, but today my attention was focused entirely on the thick manila folder resting beside me on the burgundy leather chair. The folder contained everything I'd compiled over the past week: screenshots from the Secure Home Pro app, documentation of recorded conversations, a timeline of surveillance activities, photos I'd discreetly taken of camera locations during Sunday dinner, and detailed notes about instances where my mother had acted on information she'd obtained through secret monitoring. The evidence was
comprehensive and damning, but I still felt uncertain about whether what had happened to me constituted a legal violation serious enough to warrant professional intervention. Rebecca Chen emerged from her office precisely at 9 o'clock. A woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, and the kind of confident bearing that suggested she'd built her practice by taking on cases other attorneys might consider too complex or emotionally fraught. She extended her hand with a firm grip and led me into an office that managed to feel both professional and welcoming, with warm wood furniture and carefully chosen artwork that suggested someone who understood the human cost of privacy violations. "Miss Mitchell," she said, settling behind her desk and opening a leather portfolio, "when you called, you mentioned a family surveillance situation. Why don't you start from the beginning and tell me exactly what's been happening?" Her voice carried the kind of calm authority that made me feel like whatever I was about to share wouldn't shock or overwhelm her, that she'd heard similar stories before and knew how to navigate the legal complexities they presented. I began with the notification that had appeared on my phone the previous Thursday, explaining how a simple software glitch had revealed that I'd been unknowingly connected to my mother's security system for over a year. As I described the Secure Home Pro app, the recorded conversations, and the systematic nature of the surveillance, Rebecca Chen took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about technical specifications, recording capabilities, and the specific content that had been captured. When I finished my initial explanation, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with the kind of thoughtful expression that suggested she was calculating both the legal merits of my case and the emotional toll the situation had taken. "Miss Mitchell, what you're describing potentially constitutes several different violations of both state and federal privacy laws. Oregon has some of the strongest privacy protections in the country, and recording someone without their consent in a space where they have a reasonable expectation of privacy is a serious offense." She explained that the fact that the surveillance had occurred in my mother's home didn't automatically give her the right to record guests, especially when those guests were unaware of the monitoring and had reasonable expectations of privacy during family visits. The systematic nature of the recording, the duration of the surveillance, and the use of the gathered information to manipulate family relationships all suggested potential criminal violations beyond simple privacy invasion. "The challenge," Rebecca continued, "is that family surveillance cases often involve complex emotional dynamics that can make legal resolution difficult. Courts are generally reluctant to intervene in family disputes unless there's clear evidence of significant harm or criminal behavior. However, the scope and duration of what you've described, combined with the manipulation of family relationships based on secretly gathered information, suggests this goes well beyond a typical family boundary issue. She asked to review the evidence I'd compiled, spending nearly an hour going through screenshots, reading my documentation of manipulated conversations, and examining the timeline I'd created. Her expressions grew increasingly serious as she worked through the materials, occasionally making notes or asking questions about specific incidents. "This is quite comprehensive," she said finally, looking up from the folder. "You've documented a pattern of systematic surveillance and manipulation that spans nearly 2 years. The technical evidence alone would be sufficient to support criminal charges, but the behavioral evidence you've compiled demonstrates ongoing harm and suggests premeditation that goes beyond simple privacy violation." Rebecca explained my options with the kind of thorough professionalism that made complex legal concepts accessible without being condescending. I could file a criminal complaint with the Portland Police Bureau, which would trigger an investigation and potentially lead to charges for unlawful surveillance and invasion of privacy. I could pursue civil litigation seeking damages for the privacy violation and emotional distress. I could demand that my mother cease all surveillance activities and delete existing recordings. Or I could pursue some combination of these approaches. What would you recommend? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer based on the gravity with which she'd reviewed my evidence. Rebecca considered the question carefully, her fingers steepled as she weighed the various factors involved in my case. "Given the scope and systematic nature of the surveillance, I would recommend filing a criminal complaint first," she said. "This establishes an official record of the violation and often motivates faster resolution of civil matters. The police investigation will likely uncover additional evidence and technical details that we can use in civil proceedings. Meanwhile, we'll send a formal cease and desist letter demanding immediate termination of all surveillance activities and deletion of existing recordings." She outlined a timeline that would unfold over several months, with the criminal investigation proceeding in parallel with civil litigation. The process wouldn't be quick or emotionally easy, but it would be thorough and would likely result in both criminal consequences for my mother and financial compensation for the damages I'd suffered. As I left Rebecca Chen's office that afternoon, armed with a clear legal strategy and a formal retainer agreement, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering the surveillance: hope. Not hope for repairing my relationship with my mother, which seemed irreparably damaged by her systematic deception, but hope for justice, for accountability, and for the kind of resolution that would prevent her from violating anyone else's privacy in the future. The next few days passed in a blur of legal procedures and documentation. I filed a formal complaint with the Portland Police Bureau, providing them with copies of all my evidence and a detailed statement about the surveillance activities. The investigating officer, Detective Maria Santos, was thorough and professional, asking questions that demonstrated her understanding of both the technical and emotional aspects of the case. During our interview, Detective Santos explained that technology-facilitated family surveillance was an emerging area of concern for law enforcement, with cases becoming more common as home security systems became more sophisticated and accessible. She'd handled several similar cases over the past year, though none as comprehensive or systematic as what I'd experienced. "The technical evidence you've provided is excellent," she told me, reviewing the screenshots and documentation I'd compiled. "Most victims of this type of surveillance don't discover what's happening until much later, if at all, and they rarely have the kind of detailed evidence you've gathered. This should make our investigation much more straightforward." Detective Santos explained that they would obtain a warrant to examine my mother's Secure Home Pro account, which would provide them with complete records of all surveillance activities, stored recordings, and account access logs. They would also interview my family members to determine their knowledge of and consent to the surveillance activities. 3 days after filing the criminal complaint, Rebecca Chen sent a formal cease and desist letter to my mother, demanding immediate termination of all surveillance activities, deletion of existing recordings, and confirmation that my access to the Secure Home Pro system had been removed. The letter was delivered by certified mail to ensure legal proof of receipt and to establish a formal timeline for compliance. My mother's response came not through legal channels, but through a series of increasingly frantic phone calls and text messages that began arriving within hours of her receiving the cease and desist letter. I let them all go to voicemail, following Rebecca Chen's advice to avoid direct contact that might compromise the legal proceedings.
But listening to the messages later revealed a progression from confusion to anger to desperation that suggested she was beginning to understand the serious legal consequences of her actions. "Sarah, honey, I don't understand what this letter is about." Her first voicemail began, her voice carrying the kind of forced calm that suggested barely controlled panic. "There's been some kind of mistake. Can you please call me so we can sort this out?" The message's tone suggested she was still hoping to manage the situation through family channels, to convince me that legal action was unnecessary, and that we could resolve everything through private conversation. By the third voicemail, her approach had shifted dramatically. "I can't believe you would involve lawyers in a family matter," she said, her voice tight with anger and betrayal. "After everything your father and I have done for you, this is how you repay us. By trying to destroy our family over a simple misunderstanding." The message revealed her strategy of reframing the systematic surveillance as a minor family disagreement rather than a serious legal violation. The final voicemail, left late that evening, carried a tone of desperation that might have moved me if I hadn't spent the past week reviewing recordings of my most private conversations. "Please, Sarah, just call me back. Let me explain what really happened. This whole thing has gotten blown out of proportion. I never meant to hurt you, I was just trying to keep everyone safe. Please don't let this destroy our family." Her messages revealed the psychological tactics she'd probably used throughout my childhood to manage family conflicts and avoid accountability for her actions. Reframing serious problems as misunderstandings, appealing to family loyalty to avoid consequences, and positioning herself as the victim of others' overreactions rather than acknowledging her own harmful behavior. But the surveillance recordings had given me insight into my mother's capacity for deception and manipulation that made these familiar tactics ineffective. I'd seen too much evidence of her systematic dishonesty to be swayed by appeals to family loyalty or claims that her actions had been motivated by love and concern. Kevin called the next day, his voice confused and upset. "Sarah, what's going on? Mom is freaking out about some legal thing, and Dad doesn't understand what's happening. She keeps asking if we knew about cameras in the house, and I have no idea what she's talking about." His confusion confirmed what I'd suspected. Neither Kevin nor my father had been aware of the scope of the surveillance system. I explained the situation to Kevin as gently as possible, telling him about the cameras, the recorded conversations, and the systematic monitoring that had been happening for nearly 2 years. His reaction progressed from disbelief to horror, as he realized that his own privacy had been violated, that his conversations and activities in what he'd thought was the safety of his own home had been monitored and recorded. "She recorded my bedroom?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She has recordings of me talking to my girlfriend, of private phone calls with my friends." The violation of his privacy seemed to hit him even harder than it had hit me, perhaps because he'd been living under surveillance in his own bedroom without any suspicion that his privacy was being violated. I assured Kevin that he could also file a complaint if he chose to, that his privacy had been violated just as systematically as mine, and that Detective Santos would want to interview him as part of the investigation. I also told him that Rebecca Chen had mentioned the possibility of including family members in any civil litigation if they chose to join the case. My father's call came later that evening, his voice carrying the kind of weary confusion that suggested he was struggling to process information that challenged his fundamental understanding of his own home and family. "Sarah, your mother is saying things about lawyers and police reports that don't make any sense to me. She keeps crying and asking if I knew about some security system features, but I honestly have no idea what she's talking about." Explaining the situation to my father was more difficult than talking to Kevin, partly because he seemed so genuinely bewildered by the technology involved, and partly because he was clearly struggling with the implications for his marriage. He'd trusted my mother to handle household technology decisions, never imagining that those decisions might involve systematic surveillance of family members. "I thought it was just door sensors and maybe a camera by the front entrance," he said, his voice heavy with the kind of betrayal that comes from realizing you've been deceived by someone you trusted completely. "I never would have agreed to recording people in the living room or the bedrooms. That's not security, that's spying on our own family." Detective Santos contacted me the following week with an update on the investigation. The warrant had been executed, and they'd obtained complete records from my mother's Secure Home Pro account. The evidence was even more comprehensive than what I'd been able to gather through my limited app access. "Mitchell, we've recovered over 18 months of recorded conversations, including audio and video from 6 different cameras throughout the house. Detective Santos explained during our phone conversation. The recordings include not just family members, but also friends, guests, and anyone else who visited the home during that period. The scope of the surveillance is quite extensive. She explained that they'd also discovered evidence that my mother had been actively managing the surveillance system, organizing recordings by date and participant, creating folders for different family members, and even bookmarking specific conversations for easy reference. The level of organization suggested that the surveillance hadn't been passive monitoring for security purposes, but active intelligence gathering and documentation. We're moving forward with charges for unlawful surveillance and invasion of privacy, Detective Santos continued. The evidence is clear and comprehensive, and the systematic nature of the activity suggests this goes well beyond anything that could be justified as legitimate security monitoring. The criminal charges were filed 2 weeks later, and my mother was arrested at her Beaverton home on a Wednesday morning, while my father was at work and Kevin was in class. According to Detective Santos, she cooperated with the arrest but continued to insist that the surveillance had been for family safety, and that she'd never intended to violate anyone's privacy. Her arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday, and Rebecca Chen explained that this would likely be my first time seeing my mother since the legal proceedings had begun. She prepared me for the possibility that my mother might try to make contact, might express remorse or anger, and that the emotional dynamics of the courtroom might be difficult to navigate. The arraignment itself was surprisingly mundane, a brief proceeding where my mother stood before a judge and entered a plea of not guilty to charges of unlawful surveillance and invasion of privacy. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the legal proceedings and the public nature of her accountability. When our eyes met across the courtroom, she tried to communicate something, regret perhaps, or a plea for understanding, but I found that I felt nothing but a distant sadness for what our relationship had once been. Her attorney, a public defender who looked overwhelmed by the technical complexity of the case, requested time to review the evidence and explore plea options. The judge scheduled a pre-trial conference for 6 weeks later and reminded my mother that the cease and desist order remained in effect, with any violation potentially resulting in additional charges. As I left the courthouse that morning, walking through downtown Portland toward my office at Cascade Marketing Group, I realized that the legal proceedings had given me something I hadn't expected: closure. Not the kind of tearful reconciliation that might happen in movies, but the solid satisfaction of accountability and justice. Over the following months, the case proceeded through the legal system with the kind of methodical precision that felt appropriate for addressing such a systematic violation. My mother eventually agreed to a plea bargain that included probation, community service, a substantial fine, and a permanent restraining order preventing her from any form of surveillance or monitoring of family members. The civil settlement that followed provided financial compensation for the privacy violation and emotional distress, money that I used to relocate to a larger apartment and establish a foundation for my future that was completely independent of family financial ties. More importantly, it established a legal precedent that would help protect other victims of family surveillance and technology-facilitated privacy violations. Kevin moved out of the family home and into his own apartment near campus, using some of his settlement money to establish independence that felt healthier and safer than living under potential surveillance. My father, devastated by the revelation of his wife's systematic deception, filed for divorce and began the difficult process of rebuilding his understanding of trust and family relationships. 6 months after the arraignment, I received a letter from my mother, forwarded through Rebecca Chen's office to avoid direct contact that might violate the restraining order. The letter was brief and seemed genuine in its expression of remorse, acknowledging that her actions had been wrong and expressing hope that someday I might be able to forgive her. I read the letter once and then filed it away without responding. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't something that could be demanded or negotiated through legal channels. It was something that might develop over time through my own healing process, independent of her needs or timeline for reconciliation. As autumn returned to Portland, nearly a year after that first notification had appeared on my phone, I found myself living a life that was genuinely my own for the first time in years. My apartment was a sanctuary where privacy was absolute, where conversations with Jake were truly private, where phone calls with friends were free from the anxiety of potential monitoring. Jake and I had worked through the violation together, processing the violation of his privacy alongside mine, and ultimately finding that the experience had strengthened our relationship rather than damaging it. We'd learned to communicate more directly, to value privacy and consent more deeply, and to build trust based on transparency rather than assumption. The pottery classes I'd mentioned to Jake in my parents' living room, not knowing my mother was listening, had become a regular part of my routine. Working with clay, shaping something beautiful from raw material, felt like an appropriate metaphor for rebuilding my life from the foundation up. Each piece I created was mine alone, shaped by my hands, fired in kilns that no one was monitoring, displayed in my private space, where no hidden cameras could record my satisfaction with my own creativity. Standing in my apartment one evening, looking out at the Portland skyline, and holding a mug I'd made myself, I realized that the violation that had once felt so devastating had ultimately led to the most authentic version of my life I'd ever experienced. Not because I was grateful for the surveillance, but because breaking free from it had required me to become stronger, more decisive, and more committed to protecting my own boundaries than I'd ever been before. The girl who had once accepted family dysfunction as normal, who had absorbed violations of her privacy without protest, who had prioritized family peace over personal autonomy, was gone. In her place was a woman who understood the value of privacy, the importance of consent, and the power of legal systems to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. My mother had taught me that information was power, that knowledge could be used to control and manipulate relationships, and that trust could be violated systematically without immediate consequences. She'd taught these lessons through example, rather than intention, demonstrating the devastating impact of surveillance and deception on family relationships. But I'd learned different lessons than she'd intended. I'd learned that victims of systematic violation could become advocates for justice. I'd learned that legal systems, while imperfect, could provide accountability when family systems failed. I'd learned that walking away from toxic relationships, even family relationships, could be an act of self-preservation rather than betrayal. Most importantly, I'd learned that privacy wasn't just about hiding things or keeping secrets, it was about maintaining the autonomy and dignity that made genuine relationships possible. Without privacy, without the ability to choose what to share and when to share it, relationships became performances rather than authentic connections. As I settled into bed that night, in an apartment where no cameras watched and no microphones recorded, I felt the kind of peace that comes from knowing your life is truly your own. The legal battles were over, the surveillance had ended, and the future stretched ahead full of possibilities that no one else was monitoring or recording. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new relationships built on foundations of honesty and consent, rather than deception and violation. The woman I'd become through this experience was someone I was proud to be, someone who valued privacy and respected boundaries, someone who understood that real love didn't require surveillance to flourish. And in the quiet safety of my private space, I whispered the words that had taken me nearly a year to fully believe: I am finally free. The phone call that would change everything came on a crisp Tuesday morning in March, exactly 14 months after I'd first discovered the surveillance system that had been secretly monitoring my life. I was in my new apartment in the Alberta Arts District, a spacious two-bedroom place with exposed brick walls and skylights that filled the rooms with natural light, when Rebecca Chen called with news that would finally close this chapter of my life completely. "Sarah, I have excellent news," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of an attorney who had just achieved everything her client had hoped for. "The judge has approved the final settlement terms, and we've received confirmation that all surveillance equipment has been permanently removed from your mother's property under court supervision. Additionally, the criminal restitution has been paid in full, and the restraining order has been made permanent." I set down my morning coffee, made in a ceramic mug I'd crafted myself during the pottery classes that had become my weekly refuge, and absorbed the weight of what she was telling me. After more than a year of legal proceedings, evidence gathering, court appearances, and the slow grinding machinery of justice, the case was finally definitively over. My mother would never again have the legal ability to monitor, record, or surveil me, or any other family member. The financial settlement had been substantial enough to allow me to completely restructure my life. Beyond the compensation for privacy violation and emotional distress, the court had awarded punitive damages that reflected the systematic and premeditated nature of the surveillance. I'd used part of the money to move to this new apartment, far enough from my childhood neighborhood to feel like a fresh start, but still within the Portland metro area, where my job and friendships were established. More importantly, I'd used a portion of the settlement to establish the Mitchell Privacy Protection Fund, a legal aid resource specifically designed to help other victims of family surveillance and technology-facilitated privacy violations. Working with Rebecca Chen, we'd created a program that provided both legal representation and counseling support for people who discovered they were being monitored by family members, employers, or intimate partners. The fund had already helped dozens of people navigate situations similar to what I'd experienced. Parents discovering their adult children had installed monitoring software on their devices, spouses finding hidden cameras in their homes, college students realizing their parents were tracking their location and communications without consent. Each case was unique, but they all shared the common thread of trust violated through technological surveillance. Jake stirred in the bedroom, and I heard the familiar sounds of his morning routine beginning. We'd moved in together 6 months earlier, a decision that had felt natural, and right after everything we'd been through together. Our relationship had been tested by the surveillance revelation in ways that might have destroyed a less solid foundation, but ultimately we'd emerged stronger, more committed to transparency and consent in every aspect of our shared life. The apartment we'd chosen together reflected our mutual commitment to privacy and autonomy. We'd researched the building's security policies thoroughly, ensuring that any surveillance was limited to common areas, and that our private space would remain genuinely private. We'd even had the apartment professionally swept for hidden devices, a precaution that might have seemed paranoid to others, but felt necessary, given what I'd experienced. Jake emerged from the bedroom, his dark hair tousled from sleep, wearing the Stanford computer science t-shirt he'd had since college and the kind of comfortable smile that suggested he was looking forward to the day ahead. "Morning coffee smells good," he said, padding barefoot across the hardwood floors to wrap his arms around me from behind. "Any exciting legal news from Rebecca?" I leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, and the comfort of being able to share news freely, without wondering who else might be listening. "The case is officially closed, everything's finalized, the equipment is gone, and the restraining order is permanent." I turned in his arms to face him, seeing the mix of relief and satisfaction in his expression that I knew matched my own feelings. "How does it feel?" he asked, studying my face with the kind of attention that comes from loving someone through a difficult transformation. Jake had been remarkably patient during the legal proceedings, understanding when I needed space to process emotions, supporting me through court appearances, and never making me feel like my family dysfunction was something I needed to apologize for or minimize. "It feels like I can finally breathe," I said, and realized that was exactly accurate. For over a year, part of me had been held in suspension, waiting for final resolution, wondering if my mother might find new ways to violate my privacy, or if the legal system would ultimately hold her accountable for what she'd done. Now, with permanent legal protections in place, and comprehensive financial resolution
achieved, I could finally move forward without looking over my shoulder. Jake made breakfast while I checked emails on my laptop, a domestic routine that still felt miraculous in its privacy and normalcy. No hidden cameras were recording our conversation about weekend plans. No audio devices were capturing our discussion of work challenges or relationship goals. The simple freedom to exist in private space with someone I loved, without wondering who else was listening, remained something I never took for granted. Among my emails was a message from Kevin, who had thrived since moving out of our parents' house and establishing his own independent life. He'd graduated from Portland State with honors, found a job with a nonprofit environmental organization, and was in a serious relationship with a woman named Jessica who appreciated his commitment to personal boundaries and consent. His recovery from the surveillance violation had been different from mine, perhaps because he was younger and more adaptable, but also because he'd been able to maintain some level of relationship with our father. "Coffee date this weekend," his email read. "I want to hear about your pottery exhibition and tell you about the promotion I'm hopefully getting. Also, Jessica wants to meet you properly, and I promise she's nothing like Mom in any surveillance-related ways." His humor about the situation had evolved over time from bitter anger to a kind of resigned amusement that suggested he'd processed the trauma in his own healthy way. I typed back a quick agreement, looking forward to seeing Kevin and meeting Jessica in an environment where all parties had genuinely consented to spend time together. These simple social interactions, built on foundation of mutual respect and transparency, had become precious to me in ways I might never have appreciated if I hadn't experienced their violation. My relationship with my father had evolved into something cautious but genuine over the months following my mother's conviction. Bob Mitchell had been devastated by the discovery of his wife's systematic deception, not just toward her children but toward him as well. The divorce proceedings had been swift and relatively amicable, with him keeping the house after having all surveillance equipment permanently removed under court supervision. He'd reached out to me through Rebecca Chen initially, respecting the restraining order while expressing his desire to rebuild some kind of relationship if I was willing. Our first meeting had been awkward, conducted in Rebecca's office with legal oversight, but it had established that he'd genuinely been unaware of the surveillance system's true capabilities and had been as violated by my mother's deception as Kevin and I had been. Over time, we'd developed a careful but authentic relationship built on explicit boundaries and clear communication. He respected my need for privacy, always asking permission before visiting, never pressuring me to discuss my mother or the legal proceedings, and demonstrating through consistent actions that he understood the importance of consent in family relationships. Our monthly dinners had become a source of unexpected comfort, a way of maintaining family connection without the toxic dynamics that had characterized our household for so many years. Sometimes Kevin joined us, sometimes it was just my father and me, but the interactions were always honest, respectful, and free from the manipulation and surveillance that had poisoned our previous family dynamic. As for my mother, Linda Mitchell had served 6 months in county jail, followed by 2 years of probation that included mandatory counseling for boundary violations and technology addiction. The criminal conviction had also resulted in a permanent ban on her ability to purchase or operate surveillance equipment, with violation of this restriction carrying additional felony penalties. She'd written several letters over the months forwarded through Rebecca Chen's office to avoid direct contact that might violate the restraining order. The letters had evolved from initial attempts at justification and manipulation to what seemed like genuine expressions of remorse and acknowledgement of harm. I'd read them all but hadn't responded to any, following the advice of both my attorney and the counselor I'd been seeing to process the complex trauma of family surveillance. The counseling had been invaluable in helping me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just a privacy violation but a form of psychological abuse that required professional support to process fully. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a therapist who specialized in technology-facilitated abuse and family trauma, had helped me work through the complex emotions of betrayal, violation, and grief that came with losing the family structure I'd known while simultaneously celebrating my freedom from its toxic dynamics. Surveillance by family members creates a particular type of trauma, Dr. Martinez had explained during one of our early sessions. It violates not just privacy, but the fundamental trust that makes family relationships possible. Healing from this type of abuse requires rebuilding your understanding of safety, autonomy, and healthy boundaries from the ground up. The therapy had been challenging but transformative, helping me understand that my mother's actions reflected her own psychological problems rather than any failure on my part to be a worthy daughter. I'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics I'd been subjected to throughout my childhood, patterns of control and surveillance that had been normalized in our family dynamic long before hidden cameras made them technological. 1 year after the legal proceedings concluded, I'd felt ready to write a response to my mother's letters, a carefully crafted message that acknowledged receipt of her apologies while making clear that forgiveness was a process that couldn't be rushed or negotiated. I'd expressed hope that she was genuinely working on understanding the harm she'd caused while also establishing that any future relationship would require her to respect boundaries she'd systematically violated for years. Her response had been surprisingly mature, acknowledging my right to set the terms of any potential future contact while expressing genuine understanding of why trust would need to be rebuilt slowly if at all. The correspondence had stopped there, leaving open the possibility of future reconciliation while respecting my need for continued distance and protection. This morning, as I finished responding to Kevin's email and prepared for another day at Cascade Marketing Group, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by discovering and confronting the surveillance that had been secretly monitoring me. The woman I'd become through this experience was stronger, more decisive, and more committed to protecting her own autonomy than I'd ever imagined possible. The marketing firm had been supportive throughout the legal proceedings, granting me flexibility for court appearances and understanding when the emotional toll of the case affected my work performance temporarily. My supervisor, Amanda Wells, had become a genuine friend through the process, someone who understood the professional challenges of maintaining focus while navigating complex personal trauma. I'd also discovered advocacy work that felt meaningful and connected to my experience. Beyond the Privacy Protection Fund, I'd begun speaking at legal conferences about family surveillance, helping attorneys understand the psychological impact of this type of violation and the importance of comprehensive legal remedies that addressed both financial harm and ongoing safety concerns.
The speaking engagements had led to consultation work with technology companies, helping them understand privacy concerns from the victim's perspective and develop policies that better protected users from surveillance abuse. It was satisfying work that transformed my traumatic experience into something that could help prevent similar violations for others. Jake left for his software development job with his usual kiss goodbye, a gesture that still felt special because it happened in genuinely private space, where our affection wasn't being recorded or analyzed by hidden observers. His work on mobile app security had taken on new meaning after learning about my surveillance experience, and he'd become passionate about developing technologies that protected rather than violated user privacy. As I prepared for my own workday, I caught sight of myself in the bedroom mirror and saw someone I genuinely liked and respected. The anxious, people-pleasing woman who had once absorbed family dysfunction without protest was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and wouldn't tolerate violations of her dignity or autonomy. The pottery studio where I spent Wednesday evenings had become more than just a creative outlet, it had become a metaphor for the reconstruction of my entire life. Working with clay required patience, precision, and the willingness to start over when something wasn't working. I'd learned to appreciate the meditative quality of shaping something beautiful from raw material, the satisfaction of creating objects that were entirely my own, made in private space where no cameras captured the process. My latest project was a large serving bowl intended as a housewarming gift for Kevin and Jessica's new apartment. They were moving in together next month, a relationship milestone that felt especially meaningful given our family's history with privacy violations and boundary problems. Their commitment to transparency and consent in their relationship felt like evidence that the next generation could build healthier patterns than what we'd experienced growing up. The workday passed productively, with creative meetings about upcoming campaigns and strategic planning sessions that reminded me why I'd chosen marketing as a career. The collaborative process of developing messaging and visual concepts required the kind of creative problem-solving that energized me, and my colleagues had noticed that my work had become more confident and innovative since I'd resolved the legal case that had been consuming so much mental energy. During lunch, I walked through the Pearl District, past coffee shops and art galleries, feeling grateful for the urban environment that had given me space to rebuild my identity separate from family expectations and surveillance. The neighborhood's mix of converted industrial buildings and modern development felt like an appropriate setting for someone who had reconstructed her life from the foundation up. That evening, Jake and I cooked dinner together in our spacious kitchen, a room that felt luxurious, partly because of its size and natural light, but mostly because every conversation that happened there was genuinely private. We talked about our days, made plans for a weekend hiking trip to the Columbia River Gorge, and discussed the possibility of adopting a cat from the local animal shelter. These ordinary domestic conversations, the kind that happen in millions of households every evening, felt precious because they were happening in truly private space between consenting adults who had chosen to share their lives. The simple freedom to discuss feelings, make plans and express affection without wondering who else was listening, remained something I consciously appreciated rather than taking for granted. As we cleaned up after dinner, Jake mentioned that his company was considering a job opportunity that would require relocating to Seattle. "It's a significant promotion and a substantial salary increase," he said, loading plates into the dishwasher with the careful attention he brought to most tasks. "But I wanted to discuss it with you before expressing any interest, since it would obviously affect both of us." The conversation that followed was exactly the kind of collaborative decision-making that healthy relationships required: honest discussion of professional opportunities, careful consideration of personal priorities, and mutual respect for each other's autonomy and career goals. We talked through the practical implications of relocation, the emotional aspects of leaving Portland where I'd built my independent life, and the timeline that would be involved if we decided to pursue the opportunity. "What do you think?" Jake asked as we settled onto our living room couch, the same comfortable sectional where we'd had so many important conversations over the past months. I appreciated that he was genuinely seeking my input rather than presenting a decision he'd already made, that our relationship had evolved into the kind of partnership where major choices were made collaboratively. "I think it could be an amazing opportunity," I said, surprised by how quickly I'd reached that conclusion. "Portland will always be special because it's where I learned to build an independent life, but I'm not tied here by anything except choice. And Seattle isn't far enough away to make visiting difficult if we want to maintain relationships with Kevin and your friends here." The realization that I could consider major life changes without anxiety about family surveillance or manipulation felt like a final measure of how completely I'd healed from the experience that had once seemed so devastating. The woman who had once been monitored without her knowledge, whose private conversations had been recorded and analyzed by someone who was supposed to protect her, was now free to make choices based entirely on her own priorities and desires. We spent the evening researching Seattle neighborhoods, looking at apartment listings online, and talking through the practical aspects of relocation. The conversation was animated and optimistic, full of excitement about new possibilities rather than anxiety about leaving familiar surroundings. It felt like the kind of discussion that couples have when they're confident in their relationship and excited about building a future together. As we prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 18 months earlier, I'd been an anxious young woman who avoided confrontation and absorbed family dysfunction without protest, someone whose private life was being systematically monitored without her knowledge. The transformation from that violated, controlled person to someone who was considering cross-state relocation based on career opportunities and personal desires felt like the completion of a profound metamorphosis. The trauma of discovering the surveillance had been real and significant, requiring professional support and legal intervention to address properly. But the process of confronting that violation, seeking justice, and rebuilding my life according to my own values had ultimately led to a more authentic and empowered version of myself than I might have become through easier circumstances. Standing in our bedroom, looking out at the Portland skyline through windows that no one was monitoring, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your life genuinely belongs to you. Every conversation, every decision, every moment of joy or frustration was mine to experience privately, to share selectively, and to process according to my own emotional needs rather than anyone else's surveillance agenda. Jake was already asleep when I finally turned off the bedside lamp, his steady breathing a comforting reminder that healthy relationships were built on mutual respect and shared consent rather than secret monitoring and manipulation. The darkness felt safe and private, a space where thoughts could develop naturally without concern about external observation or judgment. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought about the letter I might write to my former self, the anxious woman who had first received that surveillance notification and hadn't known how to respond. I would tell her that the violation she'd discovered was real and serious, that seeking justice wouldn't be easy but would ultimately be transformative, and that the family relationships that couldn't survive accountability and boundary setting weren't relationships worth preserving. I would tell her that privacy wasn't just about hiding shameful secrets, but about maintaining the autonomy and dignity that made authentic relationships possible. I would explain that walking away from toxic family dynamics wasn't betrayal but self-preservation, and that the courage to demand respect for her boundaries would ultimately lead to healthier relationships with people who valued consent and transparency. Most importantly, I would tell her that the experience ahead, while difficult and sometimes overwhelming, would ultimately lead to the most genuine version of her life she'd ever experienced. The woman she would become through confronting this violation would be someone she could genuinely respect and admire, someone who understood her own worth and wouldn't accept treatment that fell short of basic human dignity. But I wouldn't change anything about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The trauma had been real, but so had the growth, the empowerment, and the deep satisfaction of achieving justice through patient, strategic action. The surveillance that had once felt so violating had ultimately become the catalyst for building a life based on authentic relationships, genuine privacy, and the kind of autonomy that made every choice feel meaningful and self-directed. In the quiet safety of my private bedroom, surrounded by the life I'd built through my own decisions, and protected by legal boundaries I'd fought to establish, I whispered words that had taken nearly 2 years to become completely true. I am exactly where I belong, and no one is watching. The next morning would bring new possibilities, new conversations conducted in genuine privacy, and new opportunities to make choices based entirely on my own values and desires. But tonight, in the darkness that was truly mine, I felt the deep peace that comes from knowing your life belongs completely to you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.